Desturi za zamani za kupeleka barua, the former custom of sending letters. Sheikh Ali Hamed Abdullah al-Buri was the last of his kind, born in German East Africa in 1889. He went against the system and continued to write in the Ajami script, even though it was banned. The reason for its banning was because the ancient system of sending letters had backfired against the Germans and other Europeans for a long time, and so they sought to put a huge halt on this. It had been at least 100 years since this script was used widely within this region, and Christianity was starting to grow. The region we are talking about is Tanzania. Amongst some of the books that were carried by the Sheikh is a book called Nikahi, a handbook of the law of marriage in Islam. The contracts inside these are not new, and they reflect the history of Zanzibar and their moving around of letters and books throughout the entire states. There is a history of messages moving around this part of Africa, the Swahili coast. But how exactly did they do this? What did they need to have inside of their technological systems to pull this off? Well, first, they needed boats. There are two types of canoes that are the most available to the people living at the time. The first one is called mtumbu. This type of boat can fit one or two people and was usually used for short distance travel, sending messages from one place to another. The other type of canoe is the ngalawa. This type of canoe is found all over Africa, including places like Madagascar. As you can see, it is more of a mini ship than it is a canoe, and it has a sail. It's typically used by a very small number of people. 1 to 3 people are usually on it, but there are much bigger ones that can be used again for warfare. They can travel through the sea and have been traveling through the sea for hundreds of years. These were also used to send messages. The monsoon winds between Kilwa and India made a very easy travel route for Kilwa and Goa. Kilwa, located next to Tanzania, and Goa, located inside of India, corresponded with each other for hundreds of years. When Vasco da Gama traveled through Africa all the way to India, he noticed that there were some strategic locations, one of them being Kilwa. For a whole 5 years, Kilwa was not attacked by the Portuguese. Instead, the Portuguese allowed the local rulers to continue ruling, only levying taxes. But the taxes were so onerous that the people inside of Kilwa and Malindi found it unreasonable. And in fact, at some point, they stopped paying, leading to the Portuguese returning, but this time to take over. This is the official letter. While Portugal had not conquered Malindi at this point, they had conquered some of the seas and put a high tax on any boat going to Goa. As we read, there are similar letters from the late 16th century of Malindi, Sultan King Muhammad sending a ship to Portuguese settlement of Bassein, India, in 1586, as well as to Goa during the same year to warn the Portuguese about the Ottoman incursion of Abi Bey, who allied with some Swahili towns led by Mombasa and Pate. And around the year 1596, the same Malindi Sultan wrote to Philip II of Spain without paying taxes. He also asked for the free passage of a Malindi trading mission to China, likely to Macau, to improve his finances. These requests were granted. The latter, in particular, may have been a consequence of the decline in Malindi's trade during the late 16th century and eventual shift of the Portuguese administration of East Africa to Mombasa in 1593. Such requests of safe passage and duty-free trade also taken up by private merchants who sailed on their own ships to India. For example, the Mozambique island resident named Sharif Muhammad al-Alawi, who passed on the 1517 Malindi letter to the Portuguese, also requested a letter of safe passage for his own ship. Several later accounts mention East African merchants sailing regularly to India. An account from 1615 mentions a Mogadishu-born Mwalimu Ibrahim, who is described as an expert in navigation from Mogadishu to the Gulf of Cambay. His brother was involved in the Portuguese naval wars off the coast of Daman, while another 1619 account mentions itinerant traders from the Malindi coast visiting Goa regularly, including a trader from Pate named Muhammad Mshuti Mapengo, who was well known in Goa, where he often goes. This officially proves that the letter system over the oceans was carried out by these people at this time. And remember, the Portuguese allowed a lot of the Swahili coast to continue sending letters across the oceans duty free. This practice did not die out until the 1800s. But in the 1800s, prior to the Portuguese, the Germans, and other Europeans realizing that these people were sending secret messages to each other written in their original script, the Ajami, there was a series of letters that made their way to Goa. The Portuguese didn't even bother reading them. Even if they landed on their lap, they would pass them on to the intended host, sometimes a king and sometimes regular merchants. There are 8 pieces of paper that show 8 different times that the people of Portugal were using this method, which they first were told about by the Swahili, to send messages from one place to another. Even the messages that were sent to the Portuguese by other Portuguese living inside of this area were written in the Ajami script. But in the 1800s, when they discovered that the Queen of Kilwa was conspiring with one of the people inside of India, they decided to cut that off immediately. This is from the digital archive in Goa that houses these Swahili letters. The title is written Swahili Letters from Goa, Miscellaneous Swahili Manuscripts. The creator, Fatima Binti Muhammad. This is a black African woman who is in charge of the Kilwan Sultanate. She is a female, which tells you exactly how they felt, because in some parts of the Islamic world, a woman cannot be in charge. As we read, the correspondence contained here is a copy of originals contained in the Goa archives relating to the Portuguese period of colonization of the coast. The correspondence, although mainly illegible, is between the Crown in Lisbon and his viceroy in Goa, and is written in Portuguese. However, there is also an interesting letter by the Queen of Kilwa Kiswana. That is the letter we were looking at. Fatuma bin Muhammad, writing to a Mombasan Mwini Juma, who was based in Goa. This letter, written in Arabic script, has been extensively studied by Yahya Ali Omar and Peter Frankel, who published a translation in Africa and Uber C. Now, these letters are not just open letters that say nothing at all. Instead, they have names of people. They have reasons for sending those messages. And as you can see, the people who are sending these letters are aware of who is in Goa, when they were in Goa, and they're sending a message. So the queen is sending a message from her kingdom to Goa of an African man stationed in Goa, India. This is consistent with the entire history of the Swahili coast and their travels throughout that chain. Now remember, the Portuguese, up until the 1500s, had no real access to any of this. So when we read that the post office and the postal systems that were developed by the Portuguese and the Germans and others merely lifted some of these Swahili, India, China, Indonesia style postal systems, it is not something that is a guess, but of real information. While these boat systems are perfect on the waters, we must remember that most of the people who were stationed for these type of postal systems were not on water, but instead were on land. And according to the Portuguese and other Europeans and Arabs and Swahili writers, we know that they were all over the road. This type of message sending was crucial, not only because the people in the Swahili coast could read and write, and in fact, there is written records about entire towns being completely literate, giving themselves completely to the mosques and the Quran. From Cambridge, here we have a researcher writing about the vernacular infrastructure. As we read, the vernacular infrastructure also included modes of long distance communication. Bin Akida and Lamiri wrote about Desturi za Zamani za kupeleka barua, former customs of sending letters, which included messengers traveling the same footpath as the caravan porters. In the case of a death, for instance, the bereaved went to the baraza, a village meeting place, looking for a fleet-footed young person who could carry letters of notice to scattered relatives for non-urgent communication. A letter writer simply waited until someone from the village was going in the direction of the letter's intended recipient. If in a hurry, the composer went to the roadside to seek a passer-by going in the right direction, sometimes paying for the letter to be carried. Other systems of post, including leaving letters in strategic locations where only the recipient would know to look, existed. These fueled a religious style or a religious thought that was native to the land, that was almost outside of Islam and more traditional. Some of these understandings would lead some of the people in Swahili to refuse using the posts when the Europeans invented new systems, attaching them to their previous understandings. These understandings were not naive ideas about modern technologies. In fact, the people of the Swahili coast understood the technology quite well. What they did not want to do was to throw away their entire history for a new technology. Those who used it applied some names to them, and they are written down and archived for us to read. As we read, the stories told about the post, telegraph, and telephone then were not simply supernatural explanations for unexplainable technological wonders. The storytellers introduced invisible messengers, demons, insects, underground wires into the operation of the technology in order to incorporate into their own already complex and well understood systems of communication. And rather than naivety, people brought an experimental attitude to postal services. Binakida and Lamiri described one man, for instance, who sent a money order of 5 rupees to his brother, simultaneously dispatching a letter asking the brother to report if and when he received the money. After enough cases of successful receipt, the essayist insisted. The reputation of the post grew, so that now there is no one who does not send his money with it. The abilities of these posts to be secretive added an extra layer of protection for people like the sheikh, who sent many, many letters in the original Ajami script that was banned. And he got letters back from several people who were reinvigorating the culture. If they did not do so, we might have never known the true extent of this culture and why it is so tied with the religious customs of the Swahili coast. and why it is not only tied to the Muslims, but to the traditional African culture. But this culture goes back even further than the dates that I gave. There were some real world consequences for Vasco da Gama when it came to these cultures. Firstly, you cannot travel from one Swahili kingdom to another without written permission. This became a huge problem for Vasco da Gama as he had to slow down his mission and wait for permission while he was pretending to be a Turk traveling through the Swahili coast. At first, this worked well for Vasco da Gama, as he received many people who wanted to see this foreign Turk inside of their kingdoms. So many Zavras from Mozambique gathered and were in communication with Vasco da Gama. But Vasco da Gama did not understand the running system inside of Africa, the system that was set up for land. He just assumed that if he could outpace them on ships, that his secrets would not be discovered. And so he traveled from Mozambique to Mombasa. In Mombasa, he met a friendly king. The king said, "Come in, I'll give you whatever you want," as is written in this statement. But this was merely deception. As we read, after dinner, the Moor came back in a Zavra, accompanied by one of the king's cavaliers and a sheriff. He also brought 3 sheep. These messengers told the captain general that the king would rejoice to make peace with him and to enter into friendly relations, that he would willingly grant to the captain major all his country afforded, whether pilots or anything else. The captain major, upon this, sent word that he proposed to enter the port on the following day, and forwarded by the king's messengers a present consisting of a balandria, 2 strings of coral, 3 wash-hand basins, a hat, little bells, and 2 pieces of lamble. Messengers deployed from Mozambique, which is today 36 hours away from Mombasa, made it their mission to go and report to Mombasa this European man pretending to be a Turk. The information was so detailed that they could make a plot to capture these men on ships. And that's exactly what they were going to do. Except when they started to be deceived. Vasco da Gama called them dogs and fled to Malindi. Assuming that Vasco da Gama was merely a merchant, the king of Malindi wanted Vasco da Gama to come on shore. He had no fear of his religion or his king, and in fact, he used the typical system used in the area that if you are going in one direction, you can take a letter for the person. So he said the king would visit him on board his ship. The captain major said that he was not permitted by his master to go on land. This is a lie. And if he were to do so, a bad report would be given of him. The king wanted to know what would be said of himself by his people if he were to visit the ships, and what account could he render them. He then asked for the name of our king, which was written down for him, and said that on our return he would send an ambassador with us or a letter. Vasco da Gama from Malindi went to India and then returned. This time scarier than before. He went through Mozambique once again and Mombasa and went all the way back to Portugal. What he had discovered for the first time was this written system. If he had been aware of it, he would have never trusted any of the locals. He nearly died and failed on his mission on the coast. There are much greater stories than these to tell about what happened in these kingdoms. but that is for another day.